to study with everyone the book of Ruth because we have the upcoming holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot is Sunday night, and those of you who want to join us for learning, everybody's welcome. We're going to be studying in our yeshiva from 12 to 5. Everyone's welcome to come and give a 20-minute class. Whatever space is left over, I'll teach. And we'll study the book of Ruth and the 10 Commandments. And at 5 a.m., we'll pray the sunrise prayer. Sunrise is 5:44. And like we did this morning for Rosh Chodesh, this morning we davened also at 5:26 because the sun rose at 5:46. Anyway, I see Jill just joined. Jill, we were talking about Tom because it's his yahrzeit on Shabbos, and we were mentioning how much we miss him. And
Thank you.
I see you here, so we wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Of course. We'll talk about him again on Shabbos. Okay, so that's this Sunday night, and everybody's welcome to join us. But on the holiday of Shavuos, we read the book of Ruth. Why do we read the book of Ruth on Shavuos? Because a few reasons. Most famously, Ruth is considered to have converted, just like on the holiday of Shavuot, we converted and we became Jews. Ruth accepted the whole Torah, like we accepted the whole Torah. So also Shavuot is the birthday and the yahrzeit of King David, and Shavuos and Ruth tells the story of the precursor to the birth of David. And it's really only the last 8 verses, which is about David. Really, the story is about Ruth and Boaz. But anyway, in that context, before we get into reading the book, we're studying the book every night with Rashi's commentary on the book. I wanted to turn to some of the Talmudic texts, or really one primary Talmudic text, which talks about some background story to the book of Ruth, and we'll go over what the Talmud says about the book of Ruth. I'm referring to one Talmudic text, which is Baba Basra, Tractate Baba Basra 91a. And we'll go over this text. So the Talmud is talking about, how does it get into a discussion in the book of Ruth? Because the Talmud is talking about the prohibition of leaving the land of Israel. You're not allowed to leave the land of Israel to go outside the land of Israel unless you have tremendous tremendous economic distress. You're not allowed to leave Israel. Ein, says the Gemara, Ein Yotzin, you're not allowed to leave the land of Israel and go outside the land, because as a result of it, commentaries explain that you're not going to be able to fulfill all those mitzvot which depend upon the land of Israel. There's so many mitzvot, the tithes, and as you see in the book of Ruth, the mitzvah of leaving the gleanings of the field for the poor. Those mitzvot specifically apply in the land of Israel. In addition to that, Nachmanides says there's a positive commandment to dwell in the land of Israel, because it says in the verse, it says in Numbers chapter 33, verse 53, it says, you will inherit the land and you'll dwell there. According to Nachmanides, it's a mitzvah to dwell in the land. Anyway, so you're not allowed to leave the land. Elam Cain, why are you allowed? We see a lot of Israelis living outside the land. You ever meet an Israeli living in Bethesda, Potomac? They live here. So how can you leave if the crops are so expensive that normally where you would sell 2 portions of wheat for half of a selah, the price went up and it's now doubled. It's now a selah. So that's Rabbi Shimon. If the price of wheat doubles, you could get out of the land. And Amasai, and when was this law taught? Bizman she'eno motzi likach, but meaning to say, when you can't find any, when you don't have enough money to buy wheat for this price, meaning the price of wheat doubled and you don't have the money to buy the wheat. But if you have the amount of money to buy the wheat, then even if it went up 100 times, then you're not allowed to leave. So you're not allowed to leave the land. And now we get into the context of the book of Ruth, because Rabbi Shimon Yochai taught. Now, Rabbi Shimon Yochai, we just celebrated his Hilula of Rabbi Shimon Yochai on Lag BaOmer. We had the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Yochai says Now you're not allowed to leave the land even when there's a famine if you have money to purchase the food. How do we know this? What's the source of this? He says, because he says, Elimelech Machon and Chilyon Gedolei Hador Hayu. He says, these three figures, Elimelech, Machon, and Chilyon, who are they? These start the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth starts that there was a man from Beit Lechem whose name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and they had two children, Machon and Chilyon. And the verse tells us that they left the land. Let me read the exact verse here. It says in the book of Ruth, it says here, let me just read the exact verse. It says that there was a man who went from Beit Lechem Yehuda to dwell in the fields of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. And who is this man? This man's name was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his children were Machon and Chilyon. And they ended up marrying Ruth and Orpah. So they left the land of Israel. So there was a famine in the land, and Elimelech, Machon, and Chilyon were very wealthy. They were the Gedolei Hador Hayu. They were the wealthiest people, the leaders of the community. And what happened was there was this famine, and they left the land. And so therefore, Neiman and Shu, why were they punished? Because what happened was Elimelech died, Machon died, Chilyon died, and then Naomi was left with her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, and they decided after a period of time to go back to the land of Canaan. So that's the story of the book of Ruth. So why did Machon and Chilyon die? So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says they were punished. They were punished with death because they left from the land of Israel and they went to the fields of Moab, and for this reason and that's why they were punished with death. So the Gemara is now going to go into a riff and talk more about the story of the book of Ruth, but this is the first context that the book of Ruth is a Zionist book. I think we have to remember there's a lot of debate, like when was this story written? And the Gemara in Baba Basra 14a says that the story was written by the Beis Din of Shmuel. But even if we accept that as canon, which I don't see any reason why not to, a lot of these books were first popularized during the Second Temple period, where a lot of the Jews decided not to return from Babylon to the land of Canaan. So this could have been a major polemic against it. And we have to also bear in mind, where is this text being written? That if you leave the land of Israel, you're going to be punished with death. It's being written in the Babylonian Talmud. So that's not the Talmud of the land of Israel. So it's a Talmud of outside the land of Israel. So that's part of the irony. So they were the wealthiest people, and they should have stayed in the land. And because they left, they were punished. Okay, so now we're going to see, actually, I mean, hopefully we'll get to it, but in case we don't get to it, this is not the only theory about why they were punished with death. The only theory is not because they left the land of Israel. There's another theory, which was that because there was a famine in the land and they only cared about themselves and they hustled out of town when what they should have been doing was praying for their generation. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcho. He says that on Amud Beis. He says the reason. He said, I'll jump ahead to it and share with you in case somebody leaves early. I don't want him to think that this is the only theory about why they died. So says Rabbi Chia bar Avin in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcho. One of the theories is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcho is the son of Rabbi Akiva. He says Chas v'sholom. He said, God forbid. He says Chas v'sholom. He said, God forbid that they were punished because they left Israel for Chutz La'aretz. She'afilu matzu subin. Well, Yatzo, even if they would have found bran, subin is like bran. It's as opposed to fine wheat flour, it's the bran. Even if they just found the bran, well, yeah, so they wouldn't have left. Meaning to say, they never would have left. There was just no food. That's why they had to leave. So they were allowed to leave. So if that's the case, why were they punished? Why were they punished? They should have been praying for their generation, and they didn't pray, as it says, as it says in Isaiah 57, verse 13, when you cry out to gather in the people, you'll be saved. Meaning to say, because they didn't cry out for their generation, they were not saved. So that's the other theory. So again, there's two theories as to why these Elimelech, Machon, and Chilion died. One is because they sinned by leaving the land. And the other theory is not that they sinned, not that their sin was not in leaving the land, because they were allowed to leave the land, because the land, there was no food at all in the land. So they were punished because they didn't care about the other people enough to cry out to God and daven for them. Person should always remember, when we do our davening, when we do our prayers, we should never mention our own needs first. We should always mention, and when we ask to Hashem, we should always put someone else's needs first. They didn't cry out at all for the people of their generation, and so therefore that's the reason why they were punished. Okay, let me just pause for a second. As was pointed out by Bruce, Rashi on our text in the book of Ruth offers a third explanation. He does not cite either of the two explanations from Baba Basra 91. He cites the explanation from Ruth Rabbah, which we studied in our Rashi class on Tuesday night, and he cites the explanation which states that why did they leave? They left because of tsaros ayin, because they were stingy. That the poor people were coming to ask them for money, and therefore for this reason they were punished. And that's the third reason, that he was punished because he didn't want to support the poor. Second and the two explanations in our Gemara are that he was punished for either for the fact that he left the land at all, or else because of the fact that he didn't cry out sufficiently. Back to the text of the Talmud. The Talmud says, let's now go into a larger discussion of the book of Ruth. It says in the book of Ruth that when Naomi and Ruth returned from the fields of Moab to the land of Israel, first of all, we should also mention that Moab was not just, like, okay, I can't make it in Israel, I'm going to go to New Zealand. No, Moab was the arch enemy of the Israelites. It would be like saying, I can't make it in Israel, so I'll move to Iran. That it's the arch enemy, or whatever the arch enemy of the day is. So I'll move to Gaza. There is, I'll move to a place which is at war with the Jewish people. So it says that when Naomi and Ruth returned from Moab to Israel, it says, "Vatehom kol ha'ir alein." The whole city was astonished. This is the verse says in chapter 1, verse 19. The whole city was astonished. Vatomarna hazot Naomi, and they said, "Is this the same Naomi who left? When she left, she was the prize of the town, and now she's coming back looking like horrible. She's looking poor and a widow." So the Gemara says, what does this phrase hazot Naomi mean? What does this phrase hazot Naomi mean? So says Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amru, that the people of the town said, Chazitem Naomi sheyatzas me'eretz l'chutz haaretz ma'altala. And this verse, Naomi, what is this Naomi? It has to be read as a punishment for what Naomi did. Look what happened. Look what happens to Naomi. She left Israel, meaning to say, this is a proof. Like, what a proof. This is what happens when you leave the land of Israel for outside the land of Israel. Look what happens to her. That's why she had all this tragedy. So this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's approach as to why all these misfortunes were befalling the Jewish people. It is ironic because King David himself went for a period of time to the fields of Moab also to survive. So it is ironic that they're being criticized like this, but that's that approach. But now the Gemara goes in a different direction. Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Oso Ayom Shabbat Ruth Hamoaviyah Eretz Yisrael. That day, now we're going to get into, just in case people don't remember, Ruth comes back and she goes to beg in the field of quote unquote random field, and that field turns out to be the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech, and his name was Boaz, and Boaz was the redeemer, and he ends up marrying Ruth, and he ends up fathering the line which eventually leads to David. So Boaz is the like a supporting actor hero in this story. So this day, so the Gemara tells us more about Boaz because very little is known about him from the text. He's only mentioned in the book of Ruth, in the literal text. So the Talmud tells us other things about him. Says Rabbi Yitzchak, on that day that Ruth, the Moabitess woman, came to the land of Israel, Meso Ishtel Shel Boaz. That day that Ruth returned, it was, I don't know if it was fortuitous, but it just happened to be that the wife of Boaz died that day. And in fact, Rashi in chapter 1 to the book of Ruth, verse 19, explains when it says the whole city was astonished, he says that all of them had gathered to bury Boaz's wife. She died that day. And so he saw her that day, he buried her that day, and then soon, right after that, he ended up marrying Ruth. He was himself in bitter mourning. So from the story, we don't know anything about Boaz, but the Talmud is telling us that Boaz was also in a place of deep mourning. And actually, it's going to get worse. And that's why people say, okay, this is an expression. The Talmud is the best at expressions. The Talmud, the greatest expression. The Talmud says, Ad delo shachav shichva, which means even before the dead person dies, kaima manu beise. Already somebody is ready to take their place. Another way of saying it is that cemeteries are filled with irreplaceable people. Meaning even before we're in the ground, there's someone ready to take her place. And prior to Boaz's wife dying, Ruth was already prepared, meaning she was on her way. So she was ready to take his place. And so therefore, a person, and the point of this, what's it teaching us? What's the point of this? The point of this, says the Rashbam, is to teach us that a person should trust in God. And a person should trust in God and recognize that before the illness comes, God already has prepared the medicine. And because Ruth was on her way to marry to the land of Canaan to marry Boaz. So comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara says now the following, and this is really the reason why I was so taken by this text. Amar Rabba Barav Huna, Amar Rav, Iftzan Ze Boaz. So from our text, we have no idea who Boaz is. He's just a man who's a relative of Elimelech. But the Talmud says no, Boaz was a figure, he's the same person who's listed elsewhere in the Bible as a minor figure in the book of Judges, a minor character, meaning not that he was insignificant, but that the text barely mentions him in Judges chapter 12, verses 7 through 9. There are 3 verses about his figure, and the figure's name was Iftzan. And it says that basically after Yiftach died, came along a judge, and this judge's name was Iftzan, and Iftzan was from Beit Lechem, where we know Boaz was from. And all it says about him in Judges, actually 2 verses, Judges 8 and 9, it says he had 30 sons and 30 daughters. And he sent away his 30 daughters, and he brought in 30 girls to marry his sons, and he judged the Jewish people for 7 years. That's all it says about him. But the Talmud says that this man, who was this minor character in the book of Judges, just 2 verses about him in chapter 12, he's the same man as Boaz. So the Gemara says, okay, why are you saying this? Why? What's the message here? What does this have to do with? First of all, what are we supposed to learn from this? Why are you telling us this? Okay, now I want everybody to really pay attention, even though even though you should always pay attention. Wait till what's coming now. So the Gemara says, what's the source? So what's this teaching us? So the Gemara says, well, this relates to another teaching. Ki'idach the Rabba bar Huna, the Amarav bar Huna Amarav, Meya ve'esrem mishtaot asa Boaz lebanav. Boaz made 120 parties for his 60 sons and 60 daughters. Meaning to say, he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, but he made each of them 2 parties. So it cost a lot of money. He basically made 120 weddings. He made them a huge engagement party and a huge wedding. As it says in the verse, he sent 30, like we just read. One with his father's house and one for his father-in-law. But in all of them, he did not invite Manoach. He never invited Manoach. Who was Manoach? Manoach was the father of Samson. Now, Samson, we know that an angel visited the fields of Samson's mother and told her that she was going to have a child. But at this point, she was still without child. And so Boaz, Ibtzan, when he made all these 60 parties, did not invite Manoach because he said, why did he not invite him? He said, Kudna akara, a mule that has not given birth, b'mai paroli. How will he pay me back? Meaning to say, why should I invite him to my weddings? He's never going to invite me back to his. So he refused to invite Boaz. Now he refused to invite Samson's father. Samson wasn't born yet. So how is this possible? How is it possible that this person who was going to become the great-grandfather of David, how is he saying such a terrible thing? So it's a difficulty. It's a difficulty. So one explanation is that it was not like today where it was just anybody came to the wedding, but there was a formal agreement that you were obligated to invite the person back. It was almost like a business arrangement. And so therefore, he would have obligated him to invite him back, and he wasn't having any wedding, so therefore he wasn't willing to do it. Others explained that Manoach was a figure who was not respected, and so therefore Boaz did not want to dine with him for that reason. And so he said, meaning to say, what would I get out of this? I don't want to have a relationship with him. Others say that he was worried that Manoach would be upset, and he would embarrass him by inviting him to the weddings. But in any event, the implication of the Talmud is that Boaz did a huge sin by not inviting Manoach, because the next line says that, and this is the part that just is overwhelming for me. It states, "V'kulan metu b'chayav." All of Boaz's 120 children, basically 120 children, his 30 sons and 30 daughters with their spouses, they all died in his lifetime. They all died. And the Ben Yehoyada says he was punished because he didn't invite Manoach to any of his weddings. So as a consequence, that he's telling us that Ibtzan is Boaz, that why is the Talmud telling us this? What's the reason for this teaching? The reason for the teaching, says the Rashbam, is to tell us that if a person marries somebody and then their whole life falls apart, everybody they know in their family, they all died, everybody was finished, he should go back and remarry. And that's what Boaz did. After his wife died, after his 120 children died, he went back and he married Ruth. And that tells us who Boaz was. So I was taken by this because we know at the end of the story ends that David, it says Boaz takes Ruth, she becomes his wife. They bore a son. And then it says Boaz gave birth to Oved. Oved gave birth to Yishai. Yishai gave birth to David. So basically, Boaz gave birth to David's grandfather. So how is King David born? Everybody's focusing on Ruth. Now, David is the descendant of Ruth. That Ruth is this penniless woman. She comes, she's begging in the fields, and she becomes the great-grandmother. That's true. That's true. But on the other side, the story is powerful also, that the great-grandfather of David was a person who had lost everything. He had lost everything. He had all of his children died. He had been at the height of success. He threw 120 parties, and he lost everything. All of his children died, and his wife died, and he was all alone. And he could have just stopped living. He could have stopped living, but instead, he married Ruth. They gave birth to another child, and that child became the grandfather of the Mashiach. And that to me is an incredibly powerful lesson about where the Mashiach will come. The Mashiach will come when we don't give up hope on life. When we don't give up hope on life. He could have stopped living, but he didn't stop living. So, and anyway, the Talmud says with this powerful story, the Talmud says, and that's why people say, if in your lifetime you gave birth to 60 children who would die, shitin lamalech. And there's an expression, what good is it to have 60 children? They could all die. I mean, it's a little, obviously very morbid, but just have one child, and that one child can be basically the salvation of the world. And that's the concept here, that this person could have easily given up on life. And I guess the point for me is we never know what the perspective on life is. You never know in the moment what's the ultimate plan of God. And can you imagine Boaz at that moment when everything he had in life was taken away? How much despair he must have felt. And little did he know that his great-grandchild would be the one person who for all of eternity is on the name of every single prayer, every single Jew. We're always talking about King David. We're always yearning for King David, and all come from this man who had lost everything and didn't give up on life. So that's the point I wanted to make. Once we have the text open, I figure we do some more Talmudic text. First, I'll pause. If anybody has any questions about anything we said, no questions. Okay. When we continue, if there are no questions, we continue. So,
Rabbi, sorry.
Yes, sure. Says the Gemara says the following. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava Amar Rav Elimelech v'Salmon uploni Almoni v'Avina Ami kulon b'nei Nachshon ben Aminadav. Okay, this is another idea that again Rabbi Yosef goes to Rabbi Yosef's point. These are figures who are mentioned in the book of Ruth, and they are Salmon, who was Elimelech, who was married to Naomi, and also Salmon, who was Boaz's father, and this man Ploni Almoni. Who's Ploni Almoni? He's the person before Boaz. But we see from here, Boaz was Elimelech's nephew, according to the Talmud. Before he could marry Ruth, he says you have to go and get permission from Ploni Almoni. Ploni Almoni could either be John Doe, I mean, or what the Talmud understands is this was his actual name, that this was the actual name, was Ploni Almoni. Or maybe they don't, Rashi says they didn't want to say his name as not to embarrass, or because he didn't want to redeem Ruth. But anyway, these three figures were related, and also Avi Naami. So basically, there were four men who were all the sons of Nachshon ben, or they were all the sons of Nachshon ben Aminadab. Nachshon was the prince of Judah, who the Gemara elsewhere famously said was the first to jump into the sea, and when the sea didn't split, when they were waiting to cross the sea, he jumped in and he caused the sea to split. But he had four sons, and his four sons were Elimelech, who was married to Naomi. Another one was Salmon, who was the father of Boaz. The third son was this Ploni Almoni, who didn't want to marry Ruth and left space there for Boaz, his nephew, to marry her. And the father of Naomi was the wife of Elimelech. All of them were the children of Nachshon ben Aminadab. So these four brothers. So the Gemara says, well, my Kamashmon, what are you teaching us? I think the Gemara is saying my Kamashmon is saying, why do we care? Or why are you going to this like this is again thinly sourced? So what's the point of telling us this Agadata, this homily? So again, it comes up very hard. It's telling us, I feel avos. It's saying the point is that Elimelech had protection. He had protection from his father, from Nachshon. His father Nachshon was pious and he was a prince. But nevertheless, if he did a sin, and he did a sin without question, and the question is what it was the sin. But even if you have a strong merit of your father's, Eino Omed Eslo, it will not protect him when he leaves the land of Israel for Chutz La'aretz. And so that's the point. That point is they had all the help in the world, but since they were sinners, the merit of their ancestors did not help them. So it says Rav Chanan Barav in the name of Rav. Well, that goes into a discussion of Abraham, but it tells us who their mother's names were. We don't need to go into that. But comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara continues. The Gemara says, hold on, I'm going to skip the teachings that they say about okay, I'm skipping. They had a whole teachings there about Abraham, and I got it about Abraham, but I'm skipping that. I'm going back to their discussion. It's on 91b about Machlon and Chilion, about the children of Avimelech and Naomi. Their children of Avimelech and Naomi were Machlon and Chilion. So it says says the Gemara. It says in the beginning of the book of Ruth, it says that Machlon and Chilion. It says that Elimelech's children's names, the two boys who died, were Machlon and Chilion. But it says in Divrei Hayamim, it says in Chronicles that their names were Yoash and Sareph. So they give us a different version. So what were their real names? Were their real names Machlon and Chilion? Machlon means destruction, and Chilion means devastation. Or were their names Yoash and Seraph? So Chad Amar Machlon v'Chilion Shman. So there's two opinions in the Talmud. One is Rav and Shmuel. One says that their real names were Machlon and Chilion. Why were they called Yoash? Because you see, this goes back to the point we made before. Why were these two boys who died called Yoash? What was their name? Sheyoash min ha'geula, because they gave up hope. They lost hope in the redemption. This was the concept. This is why they had to die in order for the Messiah to be born, because they symbolize people who gave up hope in the future. The minute we give up hope in the future, that those are not ready to be the ones who are the fathers of the Messiah. Whereas Boaz, he didn't give up hope, even though he went through this devastation. So why was there? So their real names are Machon and Chalion. Why were they called Yoash? Because they gave up hope, and therefore seraph means burning, because they were obligated to be burnt for their sin of leaving their people. And alternative approach is that their real names were Yoash and Seraph. And why were they called Machon and Chalion? Machon she'asu gufan chulin, chulin she'neschayvu kliyol makom. That because they left, they made their bodies chulin, because their bodies were in a sacred state. Their bodies were serving the land of in the land of Israel. They were serving in holiness, and they left by engaging in a activity, like a mundane activity of searching for food. And so therefore, that's why their real names are not Machon and Chilion, was really Seraph and Yoash. So the Gemara tells us, the following. This approach that says that their names were Machon and Chilion is based upon a verse, Brisa. Anyway, okay, you know what? I don't want to. We'll leave this here. We'll leave this source here. We'll go back to the text. But I just wanted to read through the text of the Talmud from Baba Basra to go into this discussion, to see some of the Talmudic texts. And my big takeaway, as I said, I'll just repeat it one more time. So we have it. Hold on, right here. My big takeaway from this is that Machon and Chilion, their real sin was that they gave up hope, and Boaz's real merit was that he refused to give up hope even in the face of tragedy. And that's why Boaz is the one who was merited to be the great-grandfather of the Mashiach, great-grandfather of King David. And that, to me, is the message of Boaz's story. And in fact, going to the text of the Talmud of the book of Ruth, we see this also, that Boaz is the man who is the eternal optimist. Because now, once we know that the rabbis say that Boaz had buried his wife that day, had buried his 60 sons and daughters, now we look at Boaz's actions and we're just blown away by just how positive he is. What is the first words that Boaz says when it says in chapter 2, it says the following. That Boaz appears in chapter 2, verse 4. This is Boaz comes on the scene for the first time. Vayomer Boaz, Vayomer Vinei Boaz Bami Beit Lechem. Boaz came from Beit Lechem. And he says to the harvesters, God is with you. And they said, Yivarecha Hashem. They say, may Hashem bless you. So the Igarish Shmuel says that they were blessing him with a wife, that he'd be able to get married because his wife had just died. But to my mind, what a powerful scene. Here's this man who's in this like thickness of tragedy, and the same day of the burial, and he goes out to the harvesters and he blesses them. And he blesses them. And every word from his mouth is a word of optimism, a word of blessing, a word of generosity. And it's so often the case that when people are in their darkest moments, they can't see the positive. They can't share generously. And Boaz is the opposite of that. So Boaz says in verse 5, Vayomer Boaz l'na'aro hanitzav al kotzrim. And Boaz notices, he says, L'mi ha'na'ara hazot. Boaz notices this young woman there, which is Ruth, and he says, who is this woman? Why does the Talmud in Gemara Shabbos 113b says, why is Boaz commenting on women? He wasn't, God forbid, inappropriate. That's not what Boaz was doing, but she was the Talmud says that she was acting especially modestly until he wanted to help her. So Vayananar Hanitzava Kotrim, he says, so the person who was in charge there says she was Nara Moaviyahi, Hashava Imnami Mistei Moab. So basically, the person who responds gives a dagger. This is like when the butler says to Pharaoh, Joseph was, a Nar Eved Ivri, that there was this Hebrew slave in the prison who helped me. I criticized him. So to here also, Boaz is saying to this man says to Boaz two things about her, and both are very damning. He says she's a Moabite woman. Remember, the Moabites were the enemies of Bnei Israel at that point. You were not allowed to marry with a Moabite. They were like the pariah, the hated. You couldn't have anything to do with them. And number two, he says she's returned with Naomi from the fields of Moab. And who's Naomi? Naomi is the traitor. She left everybody behind. So he says she is a Moabite woman, and she's sided with the traitor, meaning we don't want anything to do with her. So now there's Boaz, who's in his just darkest day of his life. And he's in just a place of tremendous mourning. And here's this person who's the enemy, who's on the other side and who's sided with a traitor. And we would expect when people are in a dark place for them not to have any compassion for others. But instead, Boaz says just a moment of just complete compassion. And this is another reason why Boaz is the great-grandfather of the Mashiach. Because Boaz says to Ruth, Hawot shamat biti, listen, my daughter. He talks to her with an expression of love. He calls her his daughter. I don't remember where else in the Bible you call somebody your daughter and they're not your daughter. Just an expression of just overwhelming love. He says, do not go to gather in another field. Do not leave from here. Stay with my maidens, meaning to say, I want you to continue to pick. Basically, what he's saying is, continue to pick for free in my fields. My fields are your fields, and I want you to pick for free. This is just a moment of complete charity that Boaz is granting to Ruth. And it's just made all the more powerful by the context that the rabbis are filling in. The rabbis are filling in the mourning of Boaz, and also the obvious context that she was a Moabite woman. And then he says, he makes this point even stronger. He says, keep your eyes keep your eyes on the field which they're harvesting, and follow them, meaning to say, follow my pickers, whatever they leave behind, you take. And then he says, in addition, he says, I commanded my boys who are working in the fields not to touch you. He says, I'm providing your security. Mitzamit, and on top of that, when you're thirsty, go to my utensils. Vishatit me'asher yishavun anarim. I want you to drink freely. So he has gone beyond any set of requirements and obligations to help this woman, and this is another source for the Messiah. Why he's the great-grandfather of the Messiah. So let's see what Bruce and April have to say.